Um, yeah, I apologize for not being able to make it to the earlier ones. It's obviously early in the morning. I'm usually up this time anyway, so this is a good time. I appreciate the opportunity to come and visit with you. I'm just sharing the screen there. Hopefully that's sharing okay with folks. Try that, make it a little bit bigger. So basically, I'll just, I guess, talk through some of the results from the paper by Alice Favero, Adam Degno, and myself. I guess I should have put Adam on this paper on this as well. I won't go through all of them, and I'm going to present them slightly in a different way. I think Alice might be able to join us a little bit later for the conversation as well, and I won't do this in too much time. But one of the things I wanted to pull out of the results from that paper was that, just to look at the question of what happens to industrial wood demand over time, what happens to the carbon response to that, just in the business as usual from that paper. So assuming there's no big increase in biomass energy, of course, there's some biomass energy that's demanded from forest, even as we speak. So that's embedded in these demand effects in the future, but at pretty modest levels. And it's not actually something we separate in the model because it's part of our basic demand function. So what I did is I looked at the gross fluxes, and we know there's a massive amount of deforestation happening in the world. So I try to net all that out. So there's some loss of forest, some gross emission from the forest out there in the world that's associated with deforestation that's not captured here. This roughly 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide emission per year is just from the harvesting basically for wood products. And then the gross sequestration is all that I could attribute to that same sort of forested area that gets used for harvesting trees and whatnot. So it's not a perfect calculation. It's kind of hard to perfectly obviously do that when you have lots of things like deforestation happening in the model as well, but I did the best I could. And then the net effect is the net of everything. So I've attributed, because of deforestation being something that has largely led to a gross emission with not much of a net sequestration component to it, the net effect is the net effect for the globe. So a net of all the effects, and I've just attributed here to the sort of the forest sector in a sense. So this picture shows that over time in our model we see demand increasing modestly but increasing nonetheless for wood products, and that there is an increase in the emission from that. Now this emission, I should say as well, so many of you are well seasoned in knowing what happens to wood products after they get harvested. This is just the emission that happens when the harvest occurs and the subsequent emission of wood from the milling process, because there's some there as well as the subsequent emission of wood from solid wood product storage pools, either in landfills or something that would happen when they're actually used as products that might cause emission to happen. So I try to add together all those things to get this gross sort of emission from that sector. So it's increasing over time, not really rapidly or dramatically, but it's increasing from less than 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide emission per year up to about 2.2 by the end of the century. On the sequestration side, there's a pretty large gross sequestration initially here. And this is, I have to say, this paper actually was based on 2010 inventories. So it's before I really went through and updated the model quite significantly with a lot of brand new inventories from around the world. So, the sequestration is different than what we would expect to see today if we were to start the model with today's sort of forest, but nonetheless gives a picture of maybe kind of the last decade in a sense. So maybe this really is kind of the 2015 picture. So we see gross sequestration is bigger, but we can see, at least in our projection with that initial inventory, that over the next 30 to 40 years, there's a bit of a problem just in the baseline with the forest sector sequestering as much carbon as it's emitting. And so the net is that there's a net flux to the atmosphere from that sector. As a result, by the end of the century, there's been a lot of investment in the wood product sector because of sort of rising demands and whatnot. And we see it move back to the situation I think we're more comfortable with, which is that it's sort of a net sequestration from the atmosphere. So this kind of net picture illustrates a bit of what we think would be happening in the baseline. It's based on the 2010 inventories. Our new model, the one we've been using for the last couple of years, does have updates to most regions that have net forest inventories and does show a different picture than this. So what happens if we add a modest bioenergy shock? So I put from that paper with Alice, I took the sort of 6 watts per meter scenario, which is the most modest of the scenarios I think we looked at in terms of the demand for bioenergy. So this is not looking at a payment for forests. That paper also included scenarios that had payments for forest sequestration through sort of a carbon rental function. This doesn't include that. This just includes the bioenergy part. I left this original sort of gross and net flux from the BAU over here for comparison. And what we see in this picture is that, in fact, with modest demand for bioenergy, under these results, we found that the forest sector would essentially be a net source for about half of this century, and then move to the sink part towards the second half of the century. It's a pretty small effect, but nonetheless a positive flux to the atmosphere as a result of that relatively modest demand for wood products. The overall effect summed by the end of the century is 4.9 petagrams of carbon dioxide, a billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's just the sum of sort of all these sort of hatched line at the top. So, relatively small demand in our model doesn't induce a big response in terms of investments. It doesn't induce a big response in terms of the forest sector trying to overcome sort of the hurdle of this big increase in demand, because it's not such a big increase in demand. You can see it's a pretty modest change. It does cause in Excel me to switch this axis from 3,000 to 4,000. So there is an increase you can see, but it's not huge. Then I went with a little bit bigger one, and this is what tends to happen in our model, is that we see that a big response to forest, to an increase in demand is a big investment in forests. And what we see is that the same situation switches from an initial net flux to the atmosphere to a long run net sink by about 2030 or so. And this is caused by this initial increase. This might be considered what many would consider and talk about as this forest debt, if you will. That is when you have a kind of a sudden increase in demand, the way it was modeled in that study. It's a pretty big increase sort of initially in demand for wood products. You can't change the forest instantaneously. It takes time to change a forest from what you have today to what you might expect you want to have in the future to meet demands. So you can't do that instantly, and so you get a bit of an emission there initially. Over the century, it's about a 39.5 petagram flux from the atmosphere into the forest. So the forest is bigger or has more carbon in the future. So why does increased demand in this model lead to more forest? I kind of liken it to everything else we have out there where we have a demand for something, is that when we demand stuff, higher prices induce us to produce more of it. And pretty much every other sector we can think of, that happens. Even things where there's an immutable, what we think of as an immutable resource, like oil. There's only so much oil in the ground, right? But higher prices can induce us to go get more of it and effectively increase the supply. Food is another thing. There is a fixed amount of land out there. And we do find that the response to increasing demand for food, we saw this especially in the period earlier this century, 2005 to 2015 or so, that there was a big increase in investment in the food producing sectors and an increase in intensification as well. So, we know this happens in other sectors. We also suspect it happens in forestry, and I think there's a lot of evidence that this is exactly what we've done with trees. In our model, there's over 100 million hectares of planted industrial forests globally. And there's lots of evidence from those forests that there have been significant increases in the way we manage those. And the importance of those is, I think probably for this group, it's not hard to, sort of talk about this, but, the sense that, these forests can produce and cycle carbon pretty quickly. It's not that they themselves are dramatically increasing the carbon stored in forests. They are doing that. It's only 100 million hectares. But the effect of them doing that and releasing natural forests from timber management is potentially a bigger source of carbon sequestration and carbon benefit. So, that's kind of a dual benefit of those. 50% of greater than 50% of industrial. So these forests are a big chunk of industrial wood harvest. So this is kind of buttressing the argument as to why those forests are helping keep us out of, these natural forests. It's not likely that the demand for wood would not have grown if we hadn't had these forests be planted. So it's pretty likely that we would have been using forests with or without these intensively managed ones. So I think it's undoubtedly true that they're a benefit for the atmosphere. It doesn't mean they're a benefit for everything. Obviously, there's a lot of negative effects, biodiversity, and other kinds of things that happen with plantations, but at least as a benefit to the atmosphere, it seems pretty consistent that they are. And, my argument is that an important part of the reason why forests have been a net sink in the last century has 120 years as a result of management. Perhaps 25 to 30% of that increase in forest carbon, the net increase in forest carbon, is due to human management. We know that carbon fertilization and other natural processes have been a big chunk of that. There's also been aging, which has been a big chunk of that. But 25 to 30% of that is due to human management, the things we've done to plant plantations and the way we've managed our other forests. Obviously, there are some negative impacts of these forests. I said less natural area. If we do bioenergy, we're going to have less long-lived wood products. We could see that in our estimates that we substitute away from wood for a use in a lot of things. Obviously, we're going to have to use something. There's going to be some negative effects to that, and we put that into bioenergy, and there are higher prices as well. Is there a carbon debt? If the shock is really big, there is a carbon debt. In that 4.5 watt per meter scenario that I showed you with the increase in carbon emission, I would argue that's not really a carbon debt, because at least 50%, and probably if I went in and did the estimate, 90% of that wood was planted specifically for the purposes of harvesting trees. So I have a hard time imagining that that's a debt when that tree was put there specifically for the purposes of harvesting it in the future. So I think when we start talking about this sort of carbon debt idea with respect to biomass, we really have to think that through, because in fact, a lot of the harvesting that we're doing, and especially initially with any bioenergy policy, is going to be trees that were there because they were specifically put there for the purposes of harvesting them for something. Anyway, so I'm just going to end there. That's kind of the basics of our, I do want to say that I think one of the last thing I promised is that this is another thing we talked about in that paper, was that the wrong kinds of policy solutions can lead to worse problems. So that paper went into an extensive analysis of, how would you then incentivize, quote unquote, the right thing on forests, the economically efficient thing on forests. And we looked at a tax policy versus a sort of a rental policy, and showed that the rental policy was much better for forests. And this just shows that what happens to natural forests is you have a lot less natural forests if you have the tax policy, and a lot more natural forests if you have this quote unquote rental policy. So there are efficient ways to get what we want out of forests, and to do it in a way that leads to less harm or impact in some of the natural areas that obviously many people rightfully want to protect. So I'll stop there and open it up to any discussion, I guess.